Among all the points marked on nautical charts, Cape Horn occupies a place that transcends mere coordinates. It is the southernmost tip of Horn Island, on the edge of the Tierra del Fuego archipelago, and simultaneously a hinge between oceans and climates. To the north stretches the South Atlantic, to the west the Pacific. To the south opens the Drake Passage, the sea corridor that separates South America from Antarctica. Geographically, it seems a minor detail, a low-lying island swept by the wind in a region of channels, islets, and rocky outcrops. But in practical terms, for centuries, it was the last sliver of land to be passed before facing the harshest stretch of the open ocean. This isolated rock without great mountains or ports ultimately served as a gateway to global trade. Long before the lines appeared on European maps, this geography was the living environment of the canoe-faring peoples of the far south, such as the Yagan and Kaweska. For them, the Fuegian channels, the nearby islands, and the coasts facing the Drake Passage were not a cartographic curiosity but a territory of daily use. They understood the logic of the inland sea, the currents, the weather patterns, and the places to anchor or beach their boats. But the Cape Horn area, strictly speaking, already lay at the edge of the navigable world for those who depended on wooden and skin canoes in an extreme climate. The European arrival did not change the physical harshness of the place. It changed the scale of the problem. From the 16th century onward, ships of much greater tonnage began to arrive, with increasingly longer routes and a clear ambition to find a usable passage between the Atlantic and Pacific that did not depend on the Strait of Magellan. The first clue that open sea existed south of Tierra del Fuego came unintentionally. In 1525, the Spaniard Francisco de Oces, attempting to cross the Strait of Magellan, was driven by a storm to latitudes near 55 degrees south. He didn't chart a systematic route or describe the passage in detail, but he left evidence of a sea opening up beyond the known southernmost point. This news became a hypothesis. Perhaps the continent didn't continue indefinitely southward. Perhaps there was a waterway. Decades later, Francis Drake's circumnavigation reinforced this idea. During his voyage in 1578, Drake was forced by bad weather to head south of Tierra del Fuego and confirmed that it wasn't a continuous continent, but an archipelago surrounded by sea. However, his observations weren't enough to immediately alter practical routes. For a long time, the Strait of Magellan remained the reference southern passage, even though it was difficult, narrow, and poorly mapped. The change in scale came a century later, driven by very specific commercial reasons. At the beginning of the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company controlled the major routes to the Far East via the Cape of Good Hope and the Strait of Magellan. For rival merchants, the only way to break this monopoly was to find an alternative route that did not depend on the company's concessions or the already explored passages. The French Huguenot Isaac Lemaire then financed a specific expedition with this objective. He placed Willem Schouten and Jacob Lemaire in command, and they set sail in 1615 with two ships, the Eendracht and the Hoorn, deliberately searching for a southern passage known only as a theoretical possibility. The expedition was neither simple nor straightforward. The Hoorn was lost off the Patagonian coast after a fire, so the burden of the search fell on the Eendracht. In January 1616, the ship managed to enter through a passage now identified as the Lemaire Strait, and after several days of sailing south, sighted a rocky promontory that marked to the eye the island end of the continent. The Dutch named it Cap Hoorn, after the city of Hoorn in the Netherlands from which they had departed. It wasn't just a name, it was confirmation that a clear, easily identifiable cape existed, beyond which lay a sea corridor between America and Antarctica. From that moment on, the geographical possibility became a crucial piece of navigational information. Subsequent exploration revealed that the cape was not connected to Tierra del Fuego, but rather formed part of a smaller island within an even more complex archipelago. Such geographical precision mattered little to the shipowners of the time. What was relevant was the concept. A route existed that allowed passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific without having to navigate the Strait of Magellan, with its narrow channels, tight turns, and internal currents. For many fleets, especially those that preferred long tacks on the open sea to circular maneuvers within a labyrinth, the new passage became potentially more attractive, even though it was clearly more exposed to bad weather. As the 18th century progressed, the Cape Horn route quietly began to establish itself as an alternative to the old Indies route. As trade between Europe and the Pacific coast of the Americas increased, the Cape became an unavoidable point on the routes connecting, for example, British ports with Valparaiso, Callao, or the trading posts on the west coast. Merchant ships and warships practiced the crossing, learning to navigate those waters and accumulating experience in the form of logs, naval reports, and travelogues. The Cape's reputation for harshness grew in tandem with its usefulness. It wasn't an easy passage, but it was free of formal monopolies, with no intermediate customs beyond the constraints imposed by nature itself. In the 19th century, this utility skyrocketed. The rise of large sailing ships with clippers and four-masted vessels coincided with a global expansion of trade that transformed every possible route into an economic artery. Cape Horn became a key link between Europe and the Pacific coasts of both the Americas and Oceania. Ships laden with manufactured goods passed through, bound for Chile and Peru, and returned with guano, saltpeter, and minerals in a continuous flow that fueled both European agriculture and the finances of the industrial powers. At the same time, routes like the one that connected New York with San Francisco during the California Gold Rush took the southern shortcut. In the absence of a well-established transcontinental railroad, rounding the Cape was, paradoxically, the fastest way to connect the two coasts of the United States. The practical result was relative congestion of ships in an environment whose physical harshness remained unchanged. Clippers, designed for speed, took advantage of westerly winds in certain directions, but were exposed to the same storms that plagued slower merchant vessels. Military and scientific navigation also began to use the Southern Passage as a preferred route when circumnavigating the globe or accessing new areas of exploration in the Pacific. Each successful crossing reinforced the perception that Cape Horn was a test surmountable with sufficient skill. Each shipwreck served as a reminder that such skill guaranteed nothing. The statistics of lost ships began to accumulate in the 18th century, reaching estimated figures of hundreds of sunken hulls and thousands of sailors lost in the region. Meanwhile, the Cape acquired symbolic weight within maritime culture. It wasn't enough to have sailed long transoceanic voyages. The true mark of skill for many sailors was having rounded Cape Horn. Oral traditions and onboard customs enshrined this idea, granting symbolic privileges to those who made it through, from the right to wear a gold earring to ritual gestures at the mess table. This prestige had practical roots. Whoever had worked on deck watches, handled sails, and kept the ship under control in the latitudes of the Cape was, almost certainly, capable of performing on any other route in the world. Meanwhile, the presence of large merchant fleets around the southern tip of the Pacific influenced regional geopolitics. For Chile in particular, the control and marking of this area became strategic matters. Installing lighthouses, observation stations, and maintaining a constant naval presence not only served to assert sovereignty, but also to reduce as much as possible the accident rate in dangerous waters. The country's position as a mandatory passage between oceans placed a practical responsibility upon it. The southern tip was not a remote backdrop, but a corner of the world through which a significant portion of global shipping traffic passed. However, all this economic and symbolic weight rested on a physical basis that was not clearly discussed. Accounts from the time abounded with references to bad weather, terrible storms, or impossible seas. But rarely did they explain why the ocean seemed to concentrate so many problems in that particular area. The usual narrative remained at the level of anecdote. Such and such a ship spent weeks trapped in storms. Such and such a captain lost masts and sails. Such and such a cargo never reached its destination. A detailed understanding of the system of winds, currents, and underwater relief that makes Cape Horn an exceptional point was still in its infancy. Over time, the development of meteorology and oceanography allowed for a different understanding of this environment. What was once interpreted as a series of misfortunes began to be understood as the logical result of the atmospheric circulation of the southern hemisphere, a circumpolar ocean current, and bathymetry that raises and disrupts the waves. But these scientific explanations came too late for thousands of ships that had already paid their price. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Cape was both a well-established shipping route and a graveyard of wrecks. Cape Horn's reputation as a cursed passage stems not only from sailors' tales. There is a very precise physical structure that causes this corner of the planet to concentrate so many problems at once. To understand why so many ships have sunk here, we must first look at how the wind blows in the southern hemisphere, what currents cross this corridor, and what happens beneath the surface when the seabed changes abruptly. In the mid-latitudes of the southern hemisphere, a belt of westerly winds dominates, the famous Roaring Forties, Furious 50s, and Howling 60s, which encircle the globe almost unobstructed. Unlike the northern hemisphere, where large continental landmasses cut and deflect winds, in the south, the ocean forms a nearly continuous band around Antarctica. This lack of land allows westerly winds to blow for thousands of kilometers with little friction, fueled by the temperature contrasts between the tropics and high latitudes, and by the Earth's rotation. The practical result is a regime of strong and persistent winds with frequent storms and gusts that easily exceed what is considered normal in other seas. Cape Horn lies precisely on the edge of these wind bands, at a point where several elements converge. To the south lies the Drake Passage, a corridor of about 800 kilometers between the tip of South America and the Antarctic islands. This passage isn't a perfect tunnel, but it functions as a space where the atmosphere and ocean have free rein to accelerate. The wind doesn't just arrive strong, it arrives sustained for days. For a ship, this persistence is as dangerous as the intensity. If the storm lasted only a few hours, one could wait for it to pass. In the Drake Passage, rough seas often persist for so long that they wear down both the crew and the hull. When the wind persists, the sea grows. The mechanism is simple. The longer the wind blows over a water surface, and the greater the unobstructed distance over which it acts, the fetch, the larger and more organized the waves become. In the southern ocean belt, the unobstructed distance can span half the planet, so the sea doesn't form on a local scale but on a basin scale. Toward Cape Horn, a long swell can arrive from the Pacific, another from the Atlantic, and on top of that, the lively sea generated by the current storm. These wave trains don't always travel in the same direction or with the same period, so the result isn't a uniform swell, but a chaotic surface that moves in 3 dimensions. The ship rises and falls, but also pitches and rolls at unpredictable angles. Adding to this complex sea is the most powerful ocean current on the planet, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. This flow circles Antarctica eastward, continuously connecting the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. The Drake Passage is its narrowest point. More than 100 million cubic meters of water flow through it per second, according to modern oceanographic observations. This mass of moving water is not insignificant. It influences the way waves are structured, where cold and warm water fronts are located, and how the surface responds when a wind front arrives. There is a key interaction between wind and current. When they align, the sea can become long and fast, with waves running in the same direction as the wind. But when wind and current oppose each other, or when the current changes speed or direction over a short distance, the waves become steeper. They don't necessarily become higher, but they do become shorter between crests, more vertical, and more prone to breaking. For a ship, this means going from rough but sailable swells to a scenario where the crests crash like walls onto the bow or side. The third element is hidden, the underwater topography around the Cape. Southwest of the point, the ocean floor rises abruptly from over 4,000 meters deep to just over 200 meters in a relatively narrow strip. Imagined vertically, it's as if an invisible wall emerges from the abyss onto a shallow platform. When long, energy-laden waves travel over great depths, their profile is gentler. But upon encountering shallow waters, that energy is compressed. The wavelength shortens, the wave becomes taller and steeper, and the likelihood of breaking increases. Several observations describe precisely this behavior west and southwest of Cape Horn. The sea becomes chaotic, the crests rise, and they can reach heights of tens of meters under extreme conditions. Furthermore, there are secondary factors that worsen the situation. Air and water temperatures are low for much of the year, reducing survival time in the event of a fall overboard to minutes or hours, not days. On deck, salt spray can freeze on railings, lines, and rigging, adding weight to the upper parts of the vessel and increasing the risk of dangerous listing. Rain, snow, and hail reduce visibility. The polar night in winter and the long hours of darkness in autumn and spring further limit the ability to see approaching waves. It is not uncommon for the deck to be permanently wet and slippery at certain crossings, requiring any maneuver with little traction underfoot. Fog and sudden changes in visibility complete the picture. A ship can know its position precisely today thanks to GPS, but in the past it relied on estimation and astronomical observations when the sky permitted, and even then it could be operationally blind. The surf breaking over shallows, islets, and the coastline itself can be obscured by spray and rain. In such conditions, a slight error in course or a deviation from a stronger than expected gust can dangerously bring the vessel close to areas where waves are crashing violently against the rocks. Although for most of the year, large ice flows are concentrated further south, the Drake Passage can include, depending on the season and the specific route, drifting ice, fragments that have broken off from icebergs or sea ice flows. A road of icebergs isn't necessary for ice to be dangerous. A single isolated block appearing in the middle of an already chaotic sea with poor visibility and a fatigued crew is enough. A minor impact can damage a rudder or propeller. A major one can open a leak. For this reason, many modern Antarctic cruise routes adjust their course and schedule to minimize such encounters, even at the cost of adding miles. In short, the formula for Cape Horn is clear. Intense and persistent westerly winds, an open ocean with a huge fetch, the largest current on the planet concentrated in a relatively narrow corridor, and a seabed that rises abruptly to shallow platforms. This combination generates large, irregular, and, above all, steep waves, capable of transforming a minor malfunction into an emergency in a matter of minutes. It is no coincidence that maritime authorities, scientific organizations, and sailors agree in describing this area as one of the most treacherous stretches of sea in the world. In the era of tall ships, rounding Cape Horn was not an isolated, dramatic episode within a voyage. It meant entering a period of weeks in which all life on board was reduced to a single objective: keeping the ship seaworthy. Everything else, such as hot food, rest, and dry clothes, became an occasional luxury. The daily routine was organized around a simple and brutal idea. In the south, any delay in the maneuver could cost the entire ship. The first place where this harshness became evident was in sail handling. A cargo ship sailing south towards the latitudes of the Cape couldn't escape the storm with engines or electronics. If the wind picked up, the response was physical labor: reefing, changing sails, securing panels, reducing sail area. In fair weather, shortening sail was a demanding but manageable task. On Cape Horn, the same maneuver became a race against violent gusts, icy water lashing faces, and the ship listing. Command decisions were precise. Reducing sail too soon meant losing speed and maneuverability. Doing it too late opened the door for a gust to tear off a sail, and with it, part of the rigging, leaving the ship unbalanced. This constant tension was amplified by the watch system. Unlike a coastal voyage, in the far south there were no calm nights between days of calm seas. The shift system was repeated without interruption day after day on an almost always rough sea. While part of the crew was on deck, handling the helm, sails, and lines, the other tried to rest in damp, cold quarters. Their rest wasn't deep sleep, but a pause punctuated by waves crashing, the creaking of the hull, sudden orders, and changes of watch. Accounts from sailors who sailed on four-masted ships describe cramped berths, water seeping through the wooden joints and pooling under the floor, and bodies trying to sleep in wet clothes, shivering with cold as the ship rolled relentlessly. On deck, work always teetered on the edge between technical skill and physical risk. A basic maneuver, like adjusting a rope or securing a flapping sail, could become a perilous task as soon as the wind and swell increased. A rope under immense tension could snap suddenly and strike like an iron bar. A yardarm shifting due to a change in heel could drag a man down if he was caught out of position. A loose piece of sail flapping in the wind wasn't just fabric. It was a surface with tons of force behind it. Therefore, discipline on board wasn't just a matter of hierarchy. It was a matter of survival. Coordination and swift obedience reduced the time men spent exposed in dangerous areas of the rigging. The maneuver became especially delicate during the so-called westerly rounding, when a sailing vessel attempted to round the cape against the prevailing westerly winds. In theory, it was enough to sail close-hauled and make successive tacks. In practice, every turn in rough seas was a gamble. If the ship lost momentum at the critical moment, it could find itself broadside to the sea, taking the waves across its beam. A single misjudged stroke was enough to lose steering control and be dragged downwind towards coasts and islands where the breaking waves turned any approach into a trap. In that context, the helmsman, the officer on watch, and the maneuvering crew worked with a very clear awareness. A mistake of mere seconds could trigger hours of dangerous drift. The second defining aspect of life on board was the cold. In the latitudes of the Cape, the air and water temperatures remained low even in summer. The spray that swept across the deck wasn't just salt water. It was a constant chiller. The clothing of the time, made primarily of wool, canvas, and leather, offered some protection, but it would eventually become soaked. Sailors would spend hours with numb hands, faces chapped by the wind, and bodies tense to maintain their balance, before descending to a 'tween deck, where the dampness persisted and the air was only slightly warmer. At night, the cold mingled with the darkness and fatigue. A sailor waking for his night watch knew that several hours on deck awaited him, feeling as if he were entering a repeated punishment, leaving a damp bunk only to face even colder water. The food did little to alleviate the situation. The provisions on large sailing ships were generally typical of long voyages: hard biscuits, salted meat, dried legumes, some coffee and tea, and occasional fresh rations if they had been loaded at the last port. In rough seas, cooking became a limited and dangerous task. The stokers worked with the ship, pitching and rolling, risking the displacement of pots and fuel. As a result, many meals were quick, monotonous, and eaten standing up, with the roar of the storm as a backdrop. The body expended energy to maintain warmth and balance, while receiving a diet designed more for survival than for comfort. Beyond the physical hardship, there was a psychological component that defined life on the ships of Cape Horn. Unlike other routes, where several days of relative calm might follow a storm, in the south the sequence of storms was more continuous. The crew rarely felt as though they had emerged from the bad weather. At best, they experienced periods of less violent seas between one front and the next. This lack of respite generated a kind of underlying fatigue that affected their perception of danger. Fear wasn't expressed in dramatic scenes, but rather in the silent concentration during maneuvers, in the way they gripped the rigging as they climbed, in the quick glances toward the horizon to assess the shape of the waves. Even so, Cape Horn, over time, fostered its own unique culture among the sailors. Rounding the Cape became a symbol of their profession, to the point of giving rise to specific traditions. Among the Cape Horners, the veterans who had sailed through it, customs circulated such as the right to wear a gold earring, or certain ritualistic gestures at the table, like resting a foot on the board while eating. These were signs of recognition among professionals who knew what it truly meant to endure weeks of watch in the Roaring Forties and the Furious 50s. This prestige had a practical basis. Someone who had served on the Cape Horn could, in principle, handle any other sea in the world. Travelogues and chronicles of the time record both moments of camaraderie and episodes of extreme tension. During periods of relatively calm seas, some sailors adjusted their clothing, mended ropes, smoked when the wind allowed, or told stories in the 'tween deck. But these respites were always conditioned by the possibility of an urgent order: change course, reduce sail, prepare an emergency maneuver. Leisure was not detached from the context. Even free time was lived with the awareness that hard work could resume at any moment. In that routine, the boundary between daily life and mortal danger was thin. A slip on deck could mean falling into the sea in a place where survival in the water was measured in minutes. A poorly caught wave could crash over the side and sweep away men and equipment. A torn sail could expose the rigging to a chain of damage. That's why, over time, many crew members developed a kind of almost superstitious respect for the Cape. It wasn't just a geographical feature, but a system that seemed to always be waiting for a lapse in judgment. For officers and captains, the pressure had a different dimension. They had to balance progress with preserving the ship and ensuring the crew's safety. Reducing speed too much to protect the hull and rigging meant prolonging exposure to the hostile environment. Forcing the pace to get out of the rough area sooner increased the risk of damage. This tension between speed and safety permeated every command decision. Every time a captain chose to ride out the storm, run with a following sea, or seek a change of course to avoid the worst part of the Drake Passage, they were choosing within a narrow margin, with limited information, and knowing there would be no outside help if something went wrong. From the outside, it might seem that so many ships and sailors crossing Cape Horn proved that it was possible to tame that passage with skill and discipline. But the daily routine on board belies this notion of mastery. What was done on each watch was not controlling the sea, but negotiating with it minute by minute. And when that negotiation was forced by a material failure, a miscalculation, or an exceptionally harsh storm, the margin for maneuver was reduced to almost nothing. It is at this point that daily life on board of the Cape connects with the darkest chapter of its history: shipwrecks. Because many of the tasks that seem to be endlessly repeated, such as reefing, sailing close hauled, maintaining speed, or monitoring the drift, were, in reality, the last attempts to avoid a fatal sequence that, once unleashed, the Southern Sea rarely spared. When the daily negotiations with the sea failed, Cape Horn suddenly reminded everyone why it had earned its reputation as a graveyard. What for the crew was just another watch, a sail change, or a tack in rough seas could become the first link in a chain that ended with the ship disappearing from the record. Modern estimates speak of around 800 shipwrecks in the region of the Cape and its surroundings, and of some 10,000 sailors killed over 3 centuries of intensive navigation. This is not an exact figure, since the records are fragmentary and many losses were never documented, but it does give a sense of scale. At the southern tip, the price of connecting oceans was, for generations, exceptionally high. Attempts to quantify that cost began as early as the first quarter of the 20th century. A record compiled in 1925 tallied 345 shipwrecks in Magellanic waters since 1520. Of these, about 100 ships are believed to have been lost within the Strait of Magellan. The rest were in the vicinity of and crossings around Cape Horn. The same report warned of hundreds of ships that had sailed from European and American ports toward the Pacific without leaving a trace. That expression, "without leaving a trace," was literal. Ships that never reached their destination, nor were ever seen again, probably lost in storms where there were no survivors or witnesses. The disasters took many forms, but all followed the same physical logic described earlier. Some ships were dismasted. One or more masts broke when caught in an extreme gust with too much sail set, leaving them at the mercy of a cross-sea that pushed them to leeward. Others capsized suddenly after being struck by a series of broadside waves that overwhelmed their ability to right themselves. In conditions of low visibility, the combination of currents and fog could drag a vessel toward shallows or poorly charted islands, impact against rocks with heavy seas pushing from behind, almost never allowed for an orderly evacuation. Sometimes the sea was relatively calm on the surface, but a cross-current and a misjudged bank were enough to put a hull in the worst possible position to withstand a sudden change in the weather. Among the emblematic shipwrecks of the area, one of the most frequently cited is that of the Spanish ship of the line, the San Telmo. Built in 1788 and armed with 74 cannons, it was part of a squadron sent in 1819 to reinforce Spanish positions in the Pacific. In September of that year, while attempting to round Cape Horn, the San Telmo disappeared with 644 sailors, soldiers, and Marines on board. The hull was never recovered, but later, discoveries of wreckage in the South Shetland Islands raised the possibility that some of the crew had reached Antarctic lands, which would have made these survivors the first humans to set foot on the continent. Beyond this hypothesis, the case illustrates the extent to which even large warships could be rendered useless by the Southern Ocean. The shipwreck belt wasn't limited to the Cape in the strictest sense. Toward the Atlantic, Isla de los Estados and the Año Nuevo Islands formed another critical zone. There, the combination of fog, currents, and a historical lack of navigational aids produced a constant trickle of losses. Chronicles from the 19th and early 20th centuries speak of an average of up to 8 shipwrecks annually around Isla de los Estados during certain periods. Cases like that of the English bark River Reagan, which in 1885 was driven by fog, doldrums, and currents onto one of the Año Nuevo Islands, while sailing from Glasgow to Valparaiso, are repeated with variations in name and flag. Ships that erred by a few degrees or a few miles and ended up torn apart in the surf. The initial response to this pattern of tragedies was technical and local. Lighthouses were erected at key points, such as the San Juan de Salvamento lighthouse on Isla de los Estados, then others at the approaches to the strait and in the vicinity of Cape Horn itself, and rescue stations were established. The famous inscription that the Argentine sailor Luis Piedrabuena painted on a rocky outcrop on Isla de los Estados, "Shipwrecked sailors are rescued," reflects both the frequency of disasters and the decision to make that edge of the map a less absolute border. But the existence of lighthouses and shelters did not eliminate the risk. It merely contained it. A ship that lost control in the midst of a storm, miles from any coast, still depended solely on its hull, its rigging, and its crew. On an economic level, the Southern Graveyard had measurable consequences. Each shipwreck meant the loss of an expensive hull, its cargo, and, in many cases, the experience of a significant portion of the crew. Insurance companies, especially British and Dutch, adjusted their premiums for routes considered high risk, and the area around Cape Horn was included among the stretches with substantial surcharges. Studies on marine insurance in the 18th and 19th centuries show how ocean crossings exposed to persistent storms could double the rates compared to more benign routes, and the name of the Cape appears repeatedly as a synonym for structural risk, not isolated accidents. These massive losses, however, did not lead to abandoning the route. They led to its refinement. The need to make voyages involving crossing the southern tip, profitable accelerated innovations in hull design, the selection of timbers, the use of copper sheathing to reduce fouling and maintain speed, and later, the reinforcement of structures with iron. The race to build faster, more maneuverable ships in rough seas wasn't driven solely by commercial competition, but also by the need to reduce exposure time to the latitudes of the Horn. Each day spent in the storm zone meant one less day of risk of irreparable damage. Meanwhile, the accumulation of shipwrecks left a profound mark on the maritime culture of Chile and Argentina. Museums, naval archives, and expedition accounts began systematically recording the cases, mapping hull remains and reconstructing voyages from the few surviving documents. On Isla de los Estados, Tierra del Fuego, and Isla Hornos itself, the remains of old shipwrecks, rescue stories, and sailors' cemeteries became part of the southern landscape. Recent underwater archaeological work continues to locate sunken structures and objects that bear witness to this passage of centuries. The memory of those who died at the Cape also took shape in a visible symbol. On Isla Hornos stands the Albatross Monument, a sculpture installed in the early 1990s depicting a seabird with outstretched wings. For those crossing the Drake Passage in modern ships, it is a tourist attraction and a poignant reminder of the past. For many sailors, it is an explicit tribute to those who did not make it around the Cape. Various sources link the monument to the estimated 10,000 men lost in these waters. Where once there was only rock, wind, and a lighthouse, today there is also a permanent reminder that the route that connected oceans left a human toll difficult to imagine on an individual scale. For the communities of the region, the ship graveyard was never an abstraction. In southern ports and small coastal towns, news of a shipwreck arrived in the form of belated messages, debris washed ashore, or groups of survivors appearing days or weeks later. The local economy was affected by the loss of cargo, but also by the intermittent presence of sailors without ships, waiting to be repatriated or resettled. At the same time, The rescue and assistance efforts undertaken by navies, pilots, lighthouse keepers, and local residents reinforced the idea that the far south was not just a remote edge on trade maps, but a space of shared responsibility. Over time, the axis of world trade shifted toward less exposed routes, and the opening of the Panama Canal fundamentally altered the map of interoceanic traffic. Cape Horn ceased to be an unavoidable bottleneck and became an exceptional passage. But neither steel hulls nor modern charts erased the accumulated past. The sailing graveyard remained there beneath the waves.